Hey, welcome back. And in this video, we're going to be talking about serverless. And in particular, we're going to be talking about Google Cloud Functions, which is Google's serverless offering. And in particular, it's a functions as a service offering. So what do I mean by serverless, right? It's not like there's no servers. This isn't Harry Potter. We don't write code and then it sort of magics around the ether, right? What I mean by serverless is that we are not going to be responsible for running and managing the infrastructure below our application. That responsibility goes to our cloud platform provider. And in this case, that would be Google. Now, what advantages does that give us? It means that we are focusing on our application code, or in this case, our functions code, and therefore, we don't need to worry about things like scale, because Google will be able to scale up and down our functions within their platform as and when we require. And not only can it scale up, so if we get a lot of demand for our service, can it scale up, but it can actually scale down as well. So if nobody is using the service, then they'll basically stick it in storage for a bit and then start it up when it's needed. Why does that give us an advantage? It means we are running a pay-as-you-go service, kind of like a mobile phone, right? We're only paying for the service that we use. And I think they build to something like 100 milliseconds. So if I'm only getting 10 function calls, then I've got all the scalability that I need, but I'm only paying for a small price. Whereas if I was running the infrastructure, right? If I've got one big spike one day of the year, maybe I've got a really important day, kind of like, I don't know, the World Cup final or something like that, or the Super Bowl, then I'm not paying for my service for all the other days where I don't have that spike. But more importantly, I have the scale on that day to be able to scale up, meet the demand for that one day of spikes and deal with those peaks without having to manage my infrastructure and pay for an infrastructure for that kind of large capacity. So that's the real major advantage. But also, you get lots of other benefits as well, such as monitoring, logging. All of these things are integrated. You get a kind of full production system. But again, I don't need to build or do anything to support that. I get that as part of the service offering. So what about functions as a service? What do I mean by that? Well, there's different types of serverless. You have container as a service. So you see Google runs that as well. There's one that's Google Cloud Run is their service for containers as a service. And that's an abstraction where I worry about things at the Docker container level. And again, that's one of my favorites. And we'll talk about that in another video. But functions as a service is kind of one level below, right? Whereas I don't need to worry about the container. I'm just saying, this is my application. This is my function. You run it and you worry about the infrastructure and the application runtimes to run my functions. I'm not going to care about that. Now, of course, there's some advantages and disadvantages to that, which is if I was wanting to run a particular version of an application runtime, maybe I was wanting to run a Fastify server, or maybe I was wanting to run Node.Js version 16 or something, then I wouldn't be able to do that because I would only be able to run what the cloud provider is supporting, which would be a supported version of Node.js. So I think they only run version 14 just now. Or if it's a web server, for example, by default, Google Cloud runs Express. So if I wanted to run Fastify, then I wouldn't be able to do that because that's not the underlying application runtime that they're using. So that's kind of one of the differences, is that I'm sort of taking away some of the control that I have and just saying, here's my functions, you worry about it, you deal with it, right? So that's kind of one of the pros, whereas container as a service, then that's cool, right? Then I have more control of my application. As I said, there's pros and cons of both. But either way, it's pretty cool stuff, right? And we're going to get straight into it now, and we're just going to go and build some applications and see what it looks like. So we're going to get started right now. And in this video, we're only going to be focusing on HTTP traffic. So things like websites, APIs, etc., and creating them on Express servers and running that in Google Cloud Functions. So Google Cloud Functions does support non-HTTP type events. So it supports event-driven functionality from things like Google PubSub or asynchronous background jobs. So you can do that. But in this video, we're just going to be focusing on HTTP traffic. So with that being said, let's get started and we will fire up the laptop. So the first thing we need to do is if we can go to console.cloud.google.com, that's going to be where your main Google Cloud Platform console lives. And of course, you're going to have to sign up for that service. I've already signed up for this in advance, so we're not going to see us doing that in this video, but you will need to do that. And then probably most importantly is you're going to have to enable billing. So if you haven't enabled billing before on your machine, then if you were just to go into the billing tab that you see on my screen, and then there will be an option where it allows you to click enable billing, and then from that point you're good to go. So that's probably the only prerequisites that you have, but let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new function, so a new express service, which is really the hello world. And we're going to do that completely within the console. And then after we've done this, we're going to look at how we build a function locally and then deploy that from our machine. So as you see here, I've got an empty dashboard, and there's this link here that says create project. And that's probably the first thing to know about Google Cloud Functions, is that everything that you build needs to be hosted within the context of a project within Google Cloud. So to do that, all we're going to do is we're going to click create project. We need to give it a name. So in our case, I'll just give it something like Chuck Hello World. We'll call it test 2 because I created one called test 1 earlier and obviously deleted it, but we'll call this one Chuck Hello World test 2. And then all I need to do is click create on that, and then it will go off and create that project for me. So it'll take a few seconds to do that. But once that's created, then I'm able to then create any functions that I want to be hosted within the context of that project. As you can see on my screen now, the project is now being created, and it's sort of populated with this dashboard. And if I clicked up on that drop down at the top there, it gives me a list of all the projects that I have in my Google Cloud account just now. But let's have a look at this and look at the dashboard. You can kind of see a few things that are interesting. You can see details of my project, such as the project name, the project ID. I can add people who can access to that. You can see what resources it has. There's access to the metrics, so you can see how many requests per second is being consumed by the project at that point. And then you'll be able to look at any sort of functions. You see Google's platform status, what your billing charges are. And then, of course, you can start to create and your own monitoring dashboard. So there's a lot of functionality that you have here, which is pretty useful. But what we're going to do is we're going to create our very first create cloud function. We're going to do that within the console before we even go into VS Code. You wouldn't do this normally. You would obviously do things within something like VS Code, but I just want to show you how easy it is. So you can kind of see there's a create cloud function option in the dashboard. And if I just select that, then it's going to allow me to essentially start creating within the dashboard. So you see a button here which is called create function. So if I just click on create function, it's going to open me up into a screen where I can create something. So you see function name is function 1. So if I just call it Chuck function, it doesn't really matter what I call it. And as you see, there's a sort of list of regions. So, I can decide to run it in US, I can run it in Europe, lots and lots of different regions that I can run my functions within. So I'm just going to stick with the default, which is US Central. As I said earlier in the video, HTTP is not the only method that you can have for invoking your functions. If we click this drop down here, you can see that you can call your functions from things like Google's Cloud Pub Sub system. So that would be an event-driven based approach. So if I write an event onto Cloud Pub Sub, then essentially once that event occurs, then it will invoke the function that I write. Or I can have things like Google Cloud Storage. So if I write a file or something like that, then once that file is written, then it will invoke the function underneath. And then, of course, as you see, there's lots of other different things such as Google Analytics and Firebase and stuff. But for just now, we're going to stick to HTTP. And as you can see there's also a URL. So if I click on copy to clipboard, that's the URL for my function. So I would be able to open that up in a browser or something and then make a call to that. So nice and simple. And then you've got this authentication piece there. So I can either restrict my function to managed authorized users, within my cloud identity access management system, or I can even open it up for unauthorized calls. So in this case, if you were building a public website or a public API, then that would be the button I would use. That's what we're going to do today. But if I had a set of authorized users that I only wanted to be able to access that function, I would be able to click on this. But today we're going to have that as a sort of public function. And then, of course, I can decide whether I want it to be HTTP only or whether I want to require HTTPS. So we're going to be good corporate citizens, and we're going to make everything HTTPS, have that security, have that level of performance, etc. And then there's lots of other things that you have here in runtime and build and connections settings. So I can change the memory allocation of my service. I can change the timeouts. I can say different runtime engines, etc. I'm going to leave all of this and I can even define my auto scaling. So I can say limit it to sort of 10 instances, 20 instances, 1 instance, 2 instances is up to me, or any runtime variable. So I'm going to leave this as default, but you are very welcome to mess around with that. So now that I've set my settings, I'm just going to hit save here, and then I'm going to click next. And then it's going to go and give me a few more options. So there's a little button here that says Cloud Build API is required to use the runtime selected. Now, just to explain what that means is if I was building that within a CI/CD pipeline, something like GitHub Actions, then I wouldn't need to do this because I'd be building it locally or building it on my CI/CD pipeline and then deploying onto Cloud Functions. But because I'm doing this inline within the editor, then underneath the hood, it needs to use Cloud Build API. So to do that, I just need to hit Enable API and allow Cloud Build to be enabled for my project. And once that's enabled, then it will use Google's Cloud Build CI/CD pipeline to build my function and do the deployment underneath the hood. So that's doing that just now. It will just take a few seconds to get that set up. And now that that's set up, we can kind of go back to this and we can write our function. So the first thing I want you to kind of look at is you can decide what the underlying runtime is. So you see it supports .NET Core, it supports Go, it supports Java 11, and then there's various versions of Node.js. And then, of course, there's Python, Ruby, PHP. We are going to stick with Node.js 14 in this case. And again, you could do deployments from by doing a zip upload, etc. We're going to use the inline editor because we're just going to build something really, really quickly. And then underneath here, you can kind of see it's already pre-populated our index.json and our package.json. So, it's created a sort of sample project for us. Key thing that I want you to see is its entry point name is Hello World in this case. But actually, hopefully you can sort of get this from here, that this is really just an express service, right? So you see this exports hello world, takes its request and response there. So you see a typical arrow function type structure. You see let message equals whatever I pass in as my query. And if I haven't passed anything in, then it's going to be set to hello world. So we can test that out. I think the default message, just so we're not showing any trickery, could be, hey, everyone, okay? But as you can kind of see, it's a very, very simple hello world function. I can pass in a message, or by default, it's just going to say, hey, everyone. And of course, it's going to send me a status code of 200. So now that we've built our very, very simple application, if I click deploy, then it's going to go and create that function. Now, as you can see from my screen, it's going to take a couple of minutes for that function to get deployed. But once it's deployed, then we can get started and we can try and invoke our function and see it working. Okay, as you can see now, it's been deployed. And if I actually just click in here, I can see a couple of the details. So you'll see that I have some dashboards for my function. So I can see how many invocations per second it's been receiving, what the execution time is, how much memory it's utilizing. So as you can see, I get all of these metrics and monitoring capabilities that come as part of the platform. So that's one of the advantages of Google Cloud Functions or any functions as a service platform, is I don't need to write all of that infrastructure and monitoring capability. It all comes as part of the platform and I can just utilize it. But yeah, so there's some useful stuff. Again, you're not going to see any calls at this point because I haven't called it yet. But there's more details here. You can see, you can access the logs for the container. I can see the source. I can see any variables, what's triggering it, the permissions. So there's the logs there. So we click on that. You'll see all the logs that are associated with my function, and then finally there's kind of the ability to click and test the function. Now, as I did before, right? I copied the URL into my clipboard. So if I just open up a new tab and then I paste that here, So you can see I called this US Central Chuck Hello World Test 2 Cloud Functions, and it was called Chuck Function 1. So if I now just hit return on that, and you see it says, hey everyone. So there we go. I've got my first working application in the cloud, right? So it really was as simple as that. And as I said before, you remember we could change the any of the query parameters. So if I was to add in message and then I went hello and then hit return, you can see it comes back with hello. So my application is being built, its function is deploying, and it's working as it stands. So that's fine for unauthenticated HTTP web servers or functions, where I can just basically call it in my browser. But actually, that's not the only way of executing. So Google has a thing called Cloud Shell, which you have built into the browser. It's kind of like the Cloud SDK that will show you that you can run locally and run commands again, but this time it runs on the browser, so you don't need to install anything. So if you were to look on my screen there, you see this Activate Cloud Shell button. So if I just click on that, you will see that this kind of terminal is opening up and connecting, and so it's just creating me a little shell on the cloud, which I will be able to work with within my browser. And let me just make that a little bit bigger. But from within here, if I wanted to execute that function that we just created, then all I would need to do is just go GCloud. It would help if I could type it, and if I typed in GCloud functions, and then if I just go call, and the name of the function I had, I think, was Chuck function 1, and then if I just execute that, it's going to give me a, do you authorize this? I'm going to say yep, and then a second later it's going to come back, and you see it gives me an execution ID, but more importantly I get the hey everyone. So I can do the kind of just curl it or stick it in a browser, but if I want to execute a function within a shell, I can just use GCloud functions call, name of the function, it'll execute it back. Now that's particularly useful if you have authenticated users, because then I wouldn't be able to just shove it in the browser like that, right? But if I'm restricting things to authenticated users, that's a way I can just test that from within the browser. Okay, so as I promised before, there was a few other tricks I wanted to show with you. So this was our kind of hello world version, but I'm going to bring up the developer toolbar for a second. And then if I just do a refresh of this, and then we just open up the Chuck Hello function for a second. I'm going to cut across here. A couple of things that I want you to see is have a look at the response headers for a second. As I said before, when we were looking at the function within browser, I said it was powered by an Express server, and you see that there. You see this X powered by Express. So, and it also gives you a server, Google front end, etc. So, I'm sort of ambivalent about this. This is the sort of thing I never really like exposing headers, because it tells you what is happening in your infrastructure below that. But then the flip of this is, hey, it's Google hosted. What do I care? But anyway, you can see it's an Express server. I would probably change those headers so that that's not displayed, because I really wouldn't want people to know it's running an Express server. But there you go, X powered by Express. And that's one of the things I really like about this, is that the function as service for Node.js is powered by Express, which is really cool, because it means it's the kind of application or web server I'd be writing stuff with anyway. So I'm sort of not going against the grain, and it becomes easy to host those functions. So that's the sort of first thing I wanted to point out. The second thing I wanted to point out is they deal with all the optimizations that you would want as well. So you've got things like gzip compression, that's all dealt with for you. The other thing is also supports HTTP 2 and HTTP 3, so I can gain a lot of optimization by default and start making use of more modern protocols. So I think that's really cool as well. So it's just in a nice kind of space, and I don't need to think about it. All of the run-end infrastructure is done by Google. Now, if I come back into functions, now if I click on this, hopefully by now we would be able to see some of the metrics having been updated now that we've done a few invocations. And as you can see, if I go into my dashboard there, you start to see that some of the calls that I created earlier are appeared. So I can start to see execution call time, you've seen things are sort of around the 35 millisecond mark, which is kind of cool. You see my memory utilization for the calls that I've made. You can see that I had one instance when I made that call earlier. So all of that kind of dashboarding capability, invocations per second, is all sort of there now, which is kind of cool. Okay, so I've shown you now how you could create a function and then deploy it and invoke it all within the Google Platform Web Console, which is great, but that's not how we're going to develop things. So what we're going to do now is look at how we can work with things locally and build and deploy from my local machine from VS Code. So the first thing I'm going to do is we're going to go into my terminal for a second, and we're going to create ourselves a new directory where we're going to host our applications. So let's call this one GCP func hello, we'll call it 2, and then we'll just cd into that. So I've got an empty directory where I'm going to store my application. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do an npm init. So I'm just going to create myself a little Node.js package. And there we go. And that is now created. So it's got my package.json has automatically been created for me. So if I just do a more there, you can see it's GCP func hello 2. And that's really all I've done in that case. So the next thing I need to do is, in order to start working with the Google Cloud Functions locally, I really need to install a dev dependency, which is available as a package, which is called Google Cloud Functions Framework. And by doing that, that will give me everything I need to run those functions locally on my machine. So to do that, I just type in an npm install. And then because it's going to be a dev dependency, I'm going to do --save-dev. And then it is going to be at Google Cloud /functions-framework. And then if I hit return, that'll take a few seconds and it will install all the dependencies it needs. Again, these are dev dependencies, so it doesn't have an effect on anything. And then once it's installed, I can start working and creating my function. So if I just have a look at that, if I do a more package.json, you'll see in my dev dependencies, Google Cloud Functions Framework version 1.9 in this case. Okay, so I've done that. So what we're going to do now is we're going to create a very quick function, and then it's going to be called hey, and we'll export that so the application runtime knows what to do with it. And it's going to be expecting two parameters, which is rec and res, which stands for request and response. And that's going to be passed from Express. So they're the two parameters that it's expecting to see, and then we can just sort of run everything as we do normally. So it's an arrow function, so let me just create this, and what I will do is, like we did previously, is if you call the function and you pass in the message parameter, then we will take that message parameter and display whatever you pushed in there in the browser window. So if we just type in let message equals a rex or a request, and we're going to be looking for the parameter message. And if you don't provide a parameter, then we'll just set the default value to hey. So we'll do that. And then we will set the status to 200 for success. And then, of course, we'll send the message back. So that is our very, very simple kind of hello world function, and is equivalent to what we created before. The next thing that we need to do, though, is now when we run our application, we want it to run in the context of a Google Cloud function. We want it to behave like a Google Cloud function. And the way that we're going to do that is we are going to use the functions framework, and we're going to run our application within that context. So it's going to be pretty much equivalent to how it would run up in the cloud. So to do that, what we need to do is essentially change our scripts so that we have a start script. So whenever we type in npm start, rather than running the application as it would normally, what we want it to do is essentially run our script and run our function in the context of Google Cloud Functions. So to do that, we'll type in npx functions framework, and we're going to set our target, and that will be equal to hey. So what that means in this case is when you run npm start, it's going to call npx functions framework, and then it's going to essentially use whatever the name of the exported function was from our index.js. So in this case, we called the function hey. So you see I did exports hey. So if I called it Fred, then I would need to put the target as Fred. But we called it hey in this case, and then that's what we need to set it there. So that's how that's going to work. There are other parameters that you can pass in. So you could pass in the port number. So by default, the port is 8080. But if you wanted to change the port, you would just do a sort of a -- port and then put in whatever the port number would be. So I could do 3020 or something like that, and it would start it as that. I'm not going to do that just now. And then the other parameter there is signature type. And in this case, the default signature type is HTTP. But of course, if you wanted to do something like pub/sub or whatever, you could set that to event or cloud event. So if you were doing a different type of function invocation. So in our case, it's HTTP events. So I don't need to set anything in that case. So now that we've done that, if I just save this, so now that we've saved that, if I just come back into my terminal, if I was to type in npm start, then what you're going to see is it runs the npx functions framework, and as you can kind of guess from the screen there, it's running as HTTP localhost 8080. So if I was to open up my browser again, and then if I just put in localhost 8080, you can see it's returning hey. And then as I did before, if I passed in a message, so if I set that equal to woof, woof, then you see it's going to return woof, woof. So we've got our function up and running, but as you can probably guess, it can get quite complicated quite quickly. But one of the cool things, and this is one of the reasons I really like Google Cloud Functions, is because it runs Express underneath, I can actually just start working with Express if I wanted normally. So a good example would be as I could get rid of all of this, and then I could just write my application as I would normally. So I could then do a const require express, to create my application there. I could do a const app equals express also. So now I've got the context of my application. Now that I've done that, I can now start working with Express in the exact same ways I would normally do. So I could do an app.get here. I can, has a default endpoint. We'll do a rec res, and we'll put an arrow function in here. And then what we'll do is just sort of send a default hey, and that's fine. And then if I wanted to, I can create more endpoints. So we'll have one that says hello, and we'll send hello back in this case. And then, of course, I can do the equivalent of what I did before. So we could do a rec.query.message. I'm going to be lazy and not do the default thing in this case. And then, I think we'll do that off of message as well. And then, of course, the last thing I need to do is just export out hey. And in this case, I would set it to my app. So once I've done that, I can then, if I were to just run that locally, so if I come back to my terminal, and probably one of the key things that you need to do is you'll need to do an npm install --save express, just so that it's part of your dependencies. Now, just so you're aware, you're not really creating another dependency within there because, as I said before, it's already got an Express server built into Google Cloud Functions, but I need to put my dependency in there. But it's not really a dependency because it's already installed regardless. So now that I've done that, if I type in npm start, it's serving up my function. So if I hit hello, you see it's calling hey as it did before. And then if I do /hello, it will be running hello now. And then if I do a message, and then if I put in parameter message equals woof, woof, and it comes back with woof, woof. So very quickly, I'm able to write my applications in the same way as I did before. And that's one of the reasons I really like Google Cloud Functions and how it handles Express, right? Because it allows me to write applications the way that I would normally, and therefore increases the portability. And I'm not sort of messing around with my functions and then trying to make it work with the framework. It's much closer to the way I would develop anyway. So that's a real major plus point for Google Cloud Functions. And that's normally one of the reasons you would go to something like Google Cloud Run or any other container as a service type application, is you want a bit more control and you want a bit more portability of your application. But as you can kind of see there, the portability increases of your application here, because actually, yeah, I've got a dev dependency in Google Functions Framework, but everything else, I can write my Express application the same way as I would before. So I think that's a major plus point for this, and I really like that. So now that we've got our application and we're running it locally, what we want to now do is be able to deploy that to Google Cloud. And so let's look at how we are going to be able to do that. So what we're going to do now is, in order to deploy our function onto Google Cloud, what we need to do is install Google Cloud SDK onto our local machine. So we're going to do that very, very quickly. Now, obviously, I already have this installed on my local machine already, but let's go through the motions anyway. So if you look at my machine, all I'm going to do is type in curl https sdk.cloud.google.com, and I'm going to pipe that into bash, and then that is going to then do the installation. And it only takes a few minutes to do that. So we'll just run that very, very quickly. And we'll just do that. You can see it's already installed on my local machine. It's asking me if I want to remove it before install. I'm just going to say yes. So it's going to remove my existing version first, and then it's going to install the new version. And we're just going to do return. It takes a few seconds, and then it's going to install all the tools that I need. Okay, so the next thing it's going to ask me is, does it want to modify my profile so I can update the path and enable shell command completion? So I'm going to say yeah, and that's fine. I'm just going to run defaults, and that's good. So the last thing I need to do is just restart my shell so that the settings that I've had get applied. So to do that, we would just do a exec -l, and then we will just do a shell. And then the last thing that I need to do is just run gcloud init. So we'll do that for a second. And as you can see, because I've already done this before, then I already have a default configuration set up. So I'm just going to say, yep. And then it's going to go off and recreate everything. So once I've done that, then everything is going to be good. And then I've set the account that I'm going to be using. I'm going to default it to the project that I just created, but it doesn't really matter. And then we are up and running now. So the last thing I need to do is just obviously log into my GCloud account. So I'm just going to do gcloud auth, and then we'll do a login. And as you see, it's going to ask me to log in with my account. I'm going to pick my sort of standard account that I use. I hit OK on that, and then it says, hey, you're now authenticated and we're good to go. Okay, so now that we've got GCloud installed and we've written our function, the last thing we need to do is deploy it from our local machine. So to do that, I'm going to use the GCloud command line, and we need to pass in GCloud functions because that's the part of GCloud that we're going to be interacting with, and I want to be able to do a deploy. So it's GCloud functions deploy, and then I need to stick in the name of the entry point that I'm creating. So the name of the function that I want it to be known as. So in this case, it's GCP func hello 2. I'm going to put my entry point. So the entry point is the name of the function in my local project. So in this, i.e. the exported function name. So in this case, I called it hey. I need to also specify the runtime. So we wanted this to run as Node.js 14. So we'll just put the same in there. And then I need to specify what type of function it is, or how it's going to be triggered. So we wanted this as HTTP. So it's -- trigger -HTTP. And then the final thing I need to do is specify the project name. So the project in GCP, I think I called it Chuck Hello World Test 2. So that is the kind of the key things in this particular case. It's a GCloud functions deploy. It's the name of the function that is going to be displayed in GCloud. The entry point is the name of the function that I exported in my local project. I'm setting my runtime as Node.js 14. Remember, I did that in the web browser earlier when I created my function in the console. The next one is I'm setting my trigger for my function to be HTTP. Again, that was another one of the drop downs that we had when we did it within the browser. And then I'm setting my project, and it's just as well I've checked this because it should be -- project, not dash project. So -- project, and then it should be the name of the project that we have in our web browser. So in this case, it's Chuck Hello World Test 2. And if you're unsure of what that project name is, you can kind of go back and then you can see it's Chuck Hello World -test 2. So remember the function that I created before was chuck-function1. And then in this particular case, the name of the function that will appear in the console will be GCP func hello 2. Right? I could have given it the same name, but I couldn't remember what I called it. So if we just hit return, it'll take a few seconds. First thing I want you to sort of see though is it's created this GCloud ignore file, and we're going to go through what that is in a second. And then it's going to ask me a quick question, which is, are you going to allow unauthenticated invocations of this new function? And I'm going to say yes, because I want this to be a public function that we can call. So I'm just going to hit Y, and then it's going to go off and deploy that function in the same way as it did with the web browser. So it'll take a couple of minutes. I will speed this up a little bit, and then we'll see what that looks like. Actually, while we're waiting, you can see there it gives a sort of a kind of view of the log. So if we open that up in the browser and then just type that in there, what you will see is the logs, and you can sort of see the building status as it's going along there. So I think that's a kind of pretty cool feature, and you can just you can have a look at see what the steps are as you go along. But I'm going to close that out. We'll come back here, and then we'll wait until this deployment's finished, and then we're going to go and invoke it. Alrighty, so it seems to have been deployed now, and if I was to go back into the screen and then just do a refresh on my browser, we will see that GCP func hello 2 is now on the list there, and then I can open that up and I can have a look, and you can see it's 256 meg. It's going to call the function hey. It's a Node.js 14, and it's on the central region, so everything's set up the way that we said. If you look in the browser there, it's got the URL, so I could copy that there. Of course, I could go in here and access the URL from within the dashboard. Now, if I open up my browser and then just paste that in, and you can see it's returning hey, as we did before. And then if I was to do a /hello, you see it come back with hello. And then if I change this to message, and then I put a message as woof, woof. Let's have a third woof, woof, and it comes back with woof, woof, woof. So I've taken that function, which I deployed locally, and I can debug, and I can do whatever and run within my local environment. And then all I've done is use the command line, use the Cloud SDK to then do that manual deployment. So that's pretty cool stuff. So that is us deployed. In another video, what I will do is show how you can do that within a GitHub Action CI/CD pipeline, so that you can do that deployment outside of your Cloud Shell. But it's pretty easy stuff to do. So I've executed that a couple of times. We'll go and see that on the dashboard in a second. But before we do that, I just want to come back into VS Code for a second. And what you will see in here is it's created a new file called GCloud ignore. And by default, you see that it's sort of ignoring my Git directory, it's ignoring my Git ignore file, and it's ignoring node modules. And that's a key thing. So this GCloud ignore file works in the same way as a Docker file ignore or a Git ignore, which is any files that I specify in here won't get deployed up into Google Cloud. And therefore, you can probably guess there that I don't need my node modules. So it does that by default. So that means node modules won't be deployed when I push my package up into the cloud to be executed. So if there's anything else that you don't want included, then you would just specify that in a gcloud ignore. Very, very similar to git ignore or Dockerfile ignore. Again, you can modify this, change this, do whatever you want with that. But I just wanted you to be aware that when you do a deploy, it would automatically create that file for you. But if you needed to make any changes, then you can do that as well. And now, finally, if we go back into our dashboard for a second, what we should be able to see is all our dashboards have been updated, and you can kind of see the invocations per second. So you can see that we haven't been over 1 invocation per second, and it happened around 425, which is when we called things. You can kind of see the execution times of the functions that we called, and there you can see our sort of memory utilization. So our new function is sitting around the sort of 45 meg sort of memory utilization. So that's one of the things I could look at. I could maybe want to reduce the footprint of my application, bring it down to a smaller image. And then you can see that I've never really expanded beyond 1 instance, right? So I made my call, I've made 3 calls, but it didn't feel the need to scale up or down. It's just like 1 instance is enough. So, Google Cloud is pretty smart to sort of redirect that traffic to that one server rather than sort of doing a cold start on that. Of course, if I wanted to scale up over time, and if I had more invocations I wanted to do, then you could see the number of active instances increase. But in our case, it was 1. So there it is. Our sort of application is sort of up and running. Again, I could go and look at things like the logs and see what was put in the logs there. I didn't log anything, so you're not going to see anything in there. But actually, if you were just to do something like a console.log, then you would see stuff from your application going in there. But as you see, I haven't put anything in there, so you're just getting standard stuff like function executed, started, etc. So that is our overview of Google Cloud Functions. I think it's really cool. I think it's one of these functions as a service that it's a really clean and pure implementation, and that's one of the reasons I really like it. I don't feel as if I'm sort of working to the framework too much, and I can write code in the way that I was going to write code anyway. But I get a lot of power by having all the dashboarding and all the scaling and all that managed for me. So it's very close to having a really sort of portable implementation. Of course, if I wanted to get super portable, then I would not use something like Cloud Functions, and then I would be using something like Cloud Run. But I think this is a really great implementation, and it takes away a lot of the complexity, and I think Google's done a great job on this. So I'm a big fan of Google Cloud Functions, and I think you'll find that it's pretty easy to use. So in future videos, I will cover other aspects. So we'll maybe have a look at things like how to use event-driven functions such as pub/sub, and we'll also cover things like Cloud Run, etc., and GitHub Actions. But hopefully you found this useful, and hopefully you can kind of see the benefits of using serverless and in particular functions as a service. Anyway, we'll speak soon, and catch you in the next video.